Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about Andrew Jackson and the rise of the common man. I know on Canvas it says that I'm going to do this lecture in two parts, but I actually think I'm going to break it up into four parts just to make it a little bit more manageable. Usually in class, I spend at least a week talking about Andrew Jackson, so we'll be talking about him for the rest of this week and going into next week. So, looking here, Andrew Jackson easily won the election in 1820, and you can explain his success in a variety of ways. For one, his opponent John Quincy Adams had been a rather unsuccessful president. He was a nationalist in a time of growing sectional tension. So remember we talked about at the end of the War of 1812, uh, there was a surge in nationalism in the United States. We were so happy we had defeated the British for a second time. The country was more unified, but that breaks down rather quickly as conflict starts to arise between North and South, East and West. So there's division among the country, and John Quincy Adams really represented what they call the Eastern elite, people living in like New York City and up and around Philadelphia. And also, he was the last of the Federalist presidents. His ideas die out, the Federalist Party dies out, and we'll see the rise of what will be known as the Whig Party. So he was seen as out of touch with the American people. And so Andrew Jackson was loved by the common people, hence the title of this lecture, and supporters of Jackson were outraged at his loss in 1824. It was really due to a corrupt bargain in which Jackson, gets cheated out of the election. So Jackson will establish the Democratic Party, or he runs under the Democratic Party. Things are kind of shifting during this time, but one strategy of the the Democratic Party used to get Jackson elected was to establish an effective party structure. They created what is known as the political machine, and the idea is the political machine we still see today. So the idea of actively getting out there and campaigning for a candidate, of course, that happened beforehand, but not on the scale that Andrew Jackson does it. And so the mastermind behind this idea of the political machine was a man named Martin Van Buren. He will be Jackson's vice president. Van Buren took advantage of an upsurge in immigration to the U.S. following the War of 1812. So we see a lot more European immigrants coming to the United States after the War of 1812, and Van Buren sees these as untapped votes. Nobody is really campaigning on trying to get the immigrants' votes. And so he focused on the problems that immigrants faced and pledged to fix them. He would do things like go down to the docks as they were getting off the boats and give them soup and bread, help them get a job. But he didn't do this just out of the kindness of his heart. Those immigrants would then owe their vote to the party in return for this problem solving. So as long as you're voting for the Democratic Party or Jackson's party, you will, or as long as you're reaping the benefits and they're helping you out, you will vote for them. So that's kind of how this political machine worked. To be successful, this system required a lot of manpower, so a lot of employment by the Democratic Party. People were needed to fix those, or contact those in need, fix the problems of the masses, and ensure that the masses voted for the appropriate party, or in this case, the Democratic Party. And Van Buren successfully put together a machine and helped get Jackson elected. So this idea of targeting, what are the problems that the people are raising? How can we address those problems? Because if we can address those problems, we can in turn get their votes. And so this is how Jackson overwhelmingly gets elected later on. So you may be asking yourself, wait, how did these people get the right to vote? I thought only men with property were allowed to vote in most states. Think about, who was voting back, during George Washington's time or Thomas Jefferson's time. But things had been changing in the United States. America had shifted its voter qualifications between 1824 and 1828, making things much more democratic. Still, the majority of people were not allowed to vote. However, you can see here with this map the states that required you in 1800 to have property. You had to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. The red states, you just had to be a taxpayer and you were allowed to vote. And then the yellowish states had universal white male suffrage. So as long as you were a white man living in that state, you had the right to vote. And so you can see how many more states lifted those property requirements, and that allowed a lot more people to vote. And you can also see how many more states added universal white male suffrage by 1830. So more people were getting the right to vote. And so with this graph here, the average people got involved in politics for the first time, and you can see this with the percentage of votes. More and more people are voting leading up to the election of 1860. And in class, I would ask you guys to analyze this, but one of the things I want to point out is when you see very divisive elections, like the election of 1816, you see higher voter turnout. And I make a comparison between the last election that we saw between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We've seen higher voter turnout because it was more controversial. So the more controversial the election, the higher the voter turnout. More people are going to try to cast their vote. But nonetheless, you can see that more people are now voting, and they're going to want to vote for Jackson because he's the guy up there representing the common man. So he used this shift to his advantage, courting these new voters and placing his faith in the common man. And Jackson was a self-made man. I mean, he had, been raised in South Carolina, didn't have a lot of money. His father didn't have a lot of money. Moved out to Tennessee, worked on the frontier, became a lawyer. He was a war hero. If you remember back to the War of 1812, he had won the Battle of New Orleans. So he is a well-recognized guy and a self-made man. So Jackson, the common man, he possessed an intense distrust of the Eastern establishment and monopolies and privilege. So he was going after that Eastern establishment, those big wealthy merchants that were living in New York City or living in Boston, that the Federalist Party and a lot of presidents beforehand had kind of pandered to. And he said, nope, I'm going to focus on the common people. His heart and soul was with plain folk. Good American farmers were his chosen people, kind of similar to that of Thomas Jefferson. But Jackson is a good bit different than Thomas Jefferson. He believes more in loose construction, and he also doesn't believe that you should have to own property or anything in order to vote like Jefferson did. He saw himself as the champion of the common man. Let me see here. And so you can see here, it should be no surprise then that the vast majority of Jackson's supporters came from the South and Western areas, dominated by common farmers. So all those yellow states there were mainly made up of agriculture and farms. So you can see the ones that voted for John Quincy Adams are in the Northeast, people that were more tied to shipping and international trade, not necessarily tied to farming. But you can see here Jackson wins by a landslide in the election. So he had a broader base than just farmers. Also, the planter elite of the South liked him. Jackson was in support of slavery, and he also supported opening up Southern land to Southern planters. We'll talk more about that with the Trail of Tears and kind of a very dark spot on Jackson's presidency. And state politicians who hope for money and jobs from the national government. Jackson is not, above using kickbacks for his supporters. And immigrants in the cities. Remember, you have Martin Van Buren and the Political Machine targeting these immigrants coming into the United States, saying, hey, we're the party to vote for. We're the one that's going to represent you the best. And one of the craziest things Jackson does is right when he gets first elected, he throws a party at the White House. And this party gets so crazy. He just opens up the White House to anybody that wants to come in. Everybody's getting drunk. Things are getting knocked over. And the party gets so out of hand, Jackson actually has to flee the party, and the army had to come in and kind of die down the mob. But this will get Jackson a bunch of fame. It would be like what we'd call a publicity stunt today. Everybody's like, look at Jackson. Look how much he represents us. Look how much he's like us. He's opening up the White House for us to come party. So this was unheard of, and it really etched in people's minds that Jackson was the champion of the common man. With Jackson, the common man began to rise to political power with two important consequences. One, the culmination of radicalism of the American Revolution, and two, the formation of the Democratic Party. And when we talk about the Democratic Party, it traces its roots back to Jackson, who in turn borrowed the ideas from Jefferson's Democratic Republic. But as I said earlier, Jefferson and Jackson are pretty similar, but there are some key differences between the two men. Jefferson firmly believed that the government that governs best is the government that governs the least. So government should not be involved that much in the average person's life. The government should do very little to interfere in people's lives, and that the government should be fairly weak, especially the central government. There shouldn't be one too powerful governing body. And for all of his love of independent farmers, Jackson did not believe in universal suffrage. He did think that you had to own property. He was a good Republican, believed in civic virtue, that people would inherently just do the right thing. Thus, to vote protected democratic liberties, one must own land. However, flipping to Jackson, according to Jackson, whatever needed to be governed by the government was his duty. As long as he was carrying out the wishes of the common man, he was going to use his power as president to carry out what he needed to do. Jackson popularized the idea that the government should represent the will of the majority and should not be run by an educated elite. He believed that the average person had, a place in politics, whereas Jefferson thought, you needed to be able to read and write, and you should have a certain level of education in order to be allowed to vote. But Jackson says, no, the average man can make decisions for himself. And the common man began to push for the promise of equality contained in the Declaration of Independence. So giving those words that all men are created equal, giving them a little bit more traction, giving those rights, to more people in the United States. Obviously, we have a lot of people still left out. You have African Americans, you have any sort of minority, and also women do not have any place in politics during this time. However, more and more men are getting the opportunity to participate in politics. Jackson came to power then as a true champion of the common man, and as president, he would continue to support his chosen people like Jefferson, and the realities of the job, or would the realities of the job interfere with these principles he had ran on? And so for the second part, I'll be talking about the spoil system that Jackson uses to secure his political place as the president and give kickbacks to some of the people that help support him. So I know I went fast through this. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I will be posting this. I'll just be posting the slideshow if you need to go back and look at it on Canvas as well. Hope you guys all have a great day.